Tonight, President Trump has fired the nation's top general, C.Q. Brown Jr. His dismissal comes amid a wider wave of shakeups from the Trump administration. Brown was the second black person to serve as Joint Chiefs Chairman. Brown had been in the role since October 2023 after he was nominated by then-President Joe Biden. He is a four-star general and a fighter pilot. President Trump says he will nominate U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General Dan Kane to take over.
Welcome to State Line Media. Let's get started. General Charles Q. Brown Jr., who previously served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has broken his public silence and delivered a sharp critique of Donald Trump through an opinion piece published in Foreign Affairs magazine. During a panel discussion hosted at the Aspen Institute, he spoke candidly and without restraint.
His firing comes as President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth work to get rid of military leaders who support DEI initiatives. At the White House today, President Trump discussed a possible plan to merge the U.S. Postal Service with the Commerce Department. He says he believes that would make it run more efficiently. This as more federal jobs are being eliminated.
He directly criticized the Trump administration's decision to dismiss several of the nation's highest-ranking generals and admirals, asserting that these firings were driven by political motivations and, to put it plainly, by racial bias and gender-based prejudice as well. He also addressed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's conduct, though he framed his criticism in careful, measured diplomatic terms rather than blunt accusations. This message was delivered around the 4th of July, and when you examine his words closely or honestly, even at a surface level, he draws a parallel between Donald Trump's leadership style and that of British monarchs from centuries past.
Why is a former top general sounding an alarm now? Because he says the military is being pulled into politics. That's a big red flag. General C.Q. Brown, once the Air Force chief, says using troops for political missions is dangerous. He argues the military must stay neutral to protect democracy. After recent firings and directives, Brown warns the institution's reputation is at risk. This isn't about left or right. It's about trust.
Let me walk you through this, because the substance here is genuinely significant. Consider how the Wall Street Journal framed the story. A former senior military leader is sounding an alarm that the armed forces are becoming increasingly entangled in partisan politics. Anyone familiar with General Brown's career and demeanor understands that for him to speak out this forcefully represents a serious departure from his typical reserved public persona. It's a clear signal that something is deeply wrong. This is the same Charles Q. Brown Jr. who was removed from his position as the nation's top military officer by Pete Hegseth shortly after Trump's return to office.
In the meanwhile, the U.S. Senate has unanimously appointed an African American as the Air Force's Chief of Staff, the first time in history. A four-star General Charles Q. Brown Jr. has been elevated from his position. He is now the first black man to hold the position of the Air Force's Chief of Staff. The U.S. Senate voted 98-0 in favor of Charles Q. Brown Jr. This comes a week after General Brown released a video in which he spoke about his struggles of being a black man in America.
Remember, it was Donald Trump who originally selected him back in 2020 to serve as the Air Force's Chief of Staff, and the Senate later confirmed him with overwhelming, nearly unanimous bipartisan support when President Biden subsequently elevated him to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Despite this record of bipartisan trust and approval, Trump moved to dismiss him, largely because Pete Hegseth reportedly did not want a black officer holding the position of chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Draws its deepest strength, as Lieutenant General Hal Moore observed in his 1992 book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. American soldiers in battle don't fight for what some president says on TV. They don't fight for mom or apple pie, the American flag. They fight for one another. This is the same mutual obligation that, at its core, defines citizenship itself. The country's liberty depends on a mutual commitment to one another, regardless of color, creed, party, or military service.
He references Lieutenant General Hal Moore's 1992 memoir, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, noting Moore's observation that American troops in combat aren't fighting because of something a president said in a television broadcast. They're not fighting for symbolic ideals like apple pie or the flag itself. Rather, they fight for each other, for their fellow service members standing beside them. Brown draws a connection between this bond among soldiers and the broader concept of citizenship, arguing that this same sense of mutual responsibility and commitment underlies what it means to be a citizen in this country. The nation's freedom, he writes, hinges on citizens' mutual dedication to one another, transcending differences in race, religious belief, political affiliation, or military background.
George Washington himself worried about this abuse of power and went to great pains to avoid it in his own career. Throughout the Revolutionary War, he constantly deferred to the Continental Congress despite its calamitous delays and erratic instructions because he recognized that his authority over the Continental Army flowed from the people's representatives. Given his immense personal popularity, he was often encouraged to redress this or that political dysfunction.
We'll return to that theme momentarily, but first I want to walk through how he opens this foreign affairs essay. He begins by noting that when Americans commemorate the nation's founding and contemplate its founding principles, discussions frequently neglect a crucial element: the relationship between civilian authority and military power. He argues this omission is a significant error. Within the Declaration of Independence itself, one of the primary grievances leveled against King George III was that he sought to place military authority above and beyond the reach of civilian governance. George Washington himself was acutely aware of this danger and took deliberate, careful steps throughout his own career to prevent falling into the same trap. During the entire Revolutionary War, Washington consistently yielded to the authority of the Continental Congress, even when that body's decision-making was frustratingly slow and its instructions were inconsistent or contradictory, because he understood that his command over the Continental Army derived its legitimacy from the people's elected representatives, not from his own personal authority. Despite Washington's tremendous popularity among the public and troops alike, many urged him to use his standing to correct various political failures or dysfunctions of the time. Yet he understood that allowing the military to become a vehicle for a single commander's personal will, rather than remaining subordinate to civilian political leadership chosen by the people, would ultimately damage the young republic's long-term stability and health. Brown then explains that when the nation faces a genuine, unambiguous crisis or disaster, the American public generally welcomes and supports military intervention and assistance. He points to historical examples, such as during the Great Depression, when President Herbert Hoover deployed military resources to establish relief camps for struggling citizens, and later when President Franklin Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps, using military-style organization to provide employment opportunities for jobless Americans working on public land projects. However, he draws a distinction. When presidents choose to deploy the armed forces for missions that are inherently politically divisive, such as tackling urban crime, the situation becomes far more complicated and problematic. He argues that turning to military solutions instead of addressing the root causes of dysfunction or weakness within civilian institutions and agencies pulls the military away from concentrating on its essential purpose, preparing for and conducting combat operations. Echoing Washington's own understanding, Brown asserts that it was never the military's responsibility to rescue the republic from political gridlock or institutional failure. In fact, he warns that placing excessive and inappropriate demands on the military risks jeopardizing the entire democratic system itself. He doesn't mince words on this point. He's emphasizing that the stakes involved are enormous and potentially catastrophic for the nation's governing structure. Could his message be delivered with any greater clarity? Actually, yes, he pushes the point even further. He states that this lesson carries particular weight and relevance in the current moment. Throughout this year of historical commemoration and reflection, the military has taken on an unusually prominent ceremonial function. He acknowledges that having uniformed service members participate in honor guards, lead parades, or perform impressive flyovers is entirely appropriate and makes logical sense. The armed forces are skilled at ceremonial functions, and these events serve as a unifying symbol for the nation, helping citizens feel a sense of pride in the Republic's demonstrated strength and ability to endure challenges. Such ceremonies might even motivate some individuals to enlist in the all-volunteer armed forces. However, Brown cautions that these ceremonial displays should never be misinterpreted as evidence that the military holds exclusive ownership over the concept of patriotism. Instead, he defines genuine patriotism as recognizing and honoring the founding promises of America, appreciating the progress the nation has achieved throughout its history, and remaining hopeful about the potential for a shared, better future for all citizens. He suggests that truly patriotic individuals should also feel motivated to serve within government roles or to increase their engagement and involvement in their local communities. He notes that the military itself can play a supportive role in this broader vision of patriotism by publicly honoring and recognizing the valuable service that civilians contribute to the nation outside of any military uniform or context. Turning to another public appearance, General Brown previously spoke at Harvard University's Institute of Politics, where he offered direct commentary criticizing specific actions taken by the Trump administration. Let's examine a clip from that appearance. In it, he discusses how the United States moved hastily toward military conflict with Iran, and how this rushed approach produced deeply negative and damaging consequences. Let's play that portion of his remarks. Finally, let's turn to another segment from this same panel discussion where General Brown addressed a question concerning the deterioration of integrity within the military's promotion review process. The specific question referenced an incident in which Pete Hegseth permitted Apache helicopter flyovers as part of an event involving the musician Kid Rock, and how, after military officials issued disciplinary action related to this incident, Hegseth publicly announced he was reversing that disciplinary decision on the spot. This directly connects back to the arguments Brown laid out in his Foreign Affairs essay, where he explains that actions like this one steadily chip away at public and institutional confidence in the military as an organization. He argues that this type of behavior weakens the armed forces rather than strengthening them, contrary to what those responsible might believe or intend. He makes the point that this isn't the kind of behavior that causes other nations around the world to view America's military with greater respect or fear. Quite the opposite, he suggests that such conduct leads international observers to perceive the U.S. military as disorganized, unprofessional, or lacking seriousness, essentially, as something resembling a spectacle rather than a serious, disciplined fighting force. This is the core message General Charles Q. Brown Jr. is conveying through these public statements and his written essay. Let's play this final clip to hear his own words on the matter. To summarize the broader significance of what's happening here, we have a highly decorated, recently dismissed four-star general, one who served as the nation's top uniformed military officer under both a Republican and Democratic administration, now speaking out publicly against the very administration that removed him from his post. This isn't a disgruntled junior officer or a political operative with an obvious partisan agenda. This is someone who spent decades building a reputation as a professional, apolitical military leader, someone trusted enough to be confirmed by the Senate with near-unanimous bipartisan support. When someone with that kind of institutional credibility and career-long reputation for staying above partisan politics chooses to break his silence and speak this directly about the erosion of military norms, it deserves serious attention rather than dismissal. His essay isn't framed as a personal grievance about his own dismissal, though that context certainly informs his perspective. Instead, he grounds his argument in constitutional history, citing the Declaration of Independence's grievances against King George III and George Washington's deliberate efforts to keep the military subordinate to civilian political authority rather than becoming a tool of unchecked executive power. This historical framing matters because it positions the current concerns not as a contemporary partisan dispute, but as a recurrence of the exact same danger the nation's founders sought to prevent when they established the Republic in the first place. Brown is essentially arguing that using the military as an instrument of domestic political control, whether through politically motivated personnel decisions, deployment into American cities for politically charged purposes, or undermining the professional and merit-based structure of military promotions and discipline, represents a direct threat to the constitutional order that the founders worked to establish. The specific example involving Pete Hegseth reversing disciplinary action related to the Kid Rock event flyover isn't a minor or isolated incident in Brown's view. It represents a broader pattern where political considerations, personal relationships, or public image concerns are allowed to override established military discipline, protocol, and chain of command decisions. When this happens repeatedly, it sends a signal throughout the ranks that professional standards and accountability can be circumvented if you have the right political connections or public relations value, and that undermines the entire system of merit-based advancement and discipline that the military depends on to function effectively. Brown's point about international perception is also worth dwelling on. He's suggesting that when foreign adversaries, allies, and international observers see American military leadership making decisions based on political optics or personal loyalty rather than professional competence and established protocol, it doesn't project strength or resolve. Instead, it projects instability, unpredictability, and a lack of serious institutional discipline, qualities that adversaries could potentially exploit and that allies might find concerning when it comes to relying on American military partnership and leadership. The dismissal of General Brown himself serves as perhaps the most direct illustration of the concerns he raises in his essay. Here was an officer who had been vetted, confirmed, and trusted by leaders across the political spectrum, appointed initially by a Republican president and later promoted by a Democratic one, with the Senate's overwhelming approval both times. His removal, according to the reporting and context provided, wasn't tied to any documented failure in his professional performance or judgment. Rather, it appears to have been connected to factors entirely unrelated to merit, specifically his race, and reported discomfort from Hegseth about having him in that particular leadership role. This is precisely the kind of politicization that Brown warns against in his foreign affairs piece. If personnel decisions at the highest levels of military leadership are being made based on factors like race, gender, or perceived political loyalty rather than demonstrated competence, experience, and professional judgment, it fundamentally undermines the meritocratic principles that are supposed to govern military advancement. It also sends a chilling message to other officers throughout the ranks that their careers and positions could be at risk not because of their job performance, but because of characteristics or perceived allegiances that have nothing to do with their ability to lead and serve effectively. Brown's essay, by invoking Lieutenant General Hal Moore's reflections on why soldiers actually fight in combat, reinforces a point that's often lost in political rhetoric about the military. Service members aren't primarily motivated by abstract political slogans, presidential speeches, or partisan messaging. Their loyalty and courage on the battlefield stem from their bonds with fellow service members and their commitment to the mission and to each other. When political leaders attempt to co-opt the military's image or actions for partisan purposes, whether through staged events, politically motivated personnel decisions, or deployments designed more for political messaging than genuine national security needs, it risks corroding that fundamental bond and sense of purpose that keeps the institution functioning effectively. The comparison Brown draws to King George III and pre-revolutionary monarchy isn't a casual or exaggerated rhetorical flourish. It's a carefully considered historical parallel meant to highlight a specific and serious concern. The founders of this nation were explicitly worried about a scenario in which military power could be wielded by a single leader against the very citizens that military was supposed to protect, or used to bypass and override the authority of elected civilian representatives. Washington's own conduct during the Revolutionary War, according to Brown, exemplifies the alternative, a military leader who consistently deferred to civilian political authority even when it would have been easier, faster, or more popular to act unilaterally based on his own judgment and immense personal popularity. Given this historical context, Brown's warning about deploying troops into American cities under the banner of fighting crime takes on additional weight. He's not arguing that crime isn't a legitimate concern, or that all military assistance to civilian authorities is inappropriate. He specifically cites the New Deal-era examples of military involvement in civilian relief efforts as instances where such cooperation made sense and served the public good. Instead, his concern centers on situations where military deployment becomes politically charged, controversial, or divisive, and where genuine underlying problems within civilian institutions and law enforcement agencies remain unaddressed while the military is used as a more visible but less appropriate substitute solution. This distinction matters because it shapes how we should understand Brown's broader argument. He's not opposed to the military playing supportive roles in national challenges or ceremonial functions that unify the country. He explicitly endorses activities like honor guards, parades, and flyovers as appropriate uses of military symbolism and capability. His concern is specifically about the boundary between appropriate ceremonial or genuinely necessary humanitarian military involvement versus using the military as a tool for politically motivated domestic action that oversteps its traditional, constitutionally appropriate role. The broader implications of General Brown's public statements extend beyond just criticism of specific personnel decisions or individual incidents. He's making a structural argument about the health of American democratic institutions and the critical importance of maintaining clear boundaries between civilian political authority and military power. His essay serves as a warning that these boundaries, once eroded through politically motivated personnel decisions, inappropriate deployments, or the undermining of merit-based military discipline and promotion systems, become increasingly difficult to restore and protect. For a figure with General Brown's background and reputation, someone who spent his entire career building trust across the political spectrum and who reached the pinnacle of military leadership through demonstrated competence and bipartisan confirmation, to speak out this publicly and pointedly represents a significant moment. It's a signal that concerns about the politicization of the armed forces aren't confined to partisan critics or political commentators, but are shared by some of the very military leaders who have dedicated their careers to upholding the institution's traditional apolitical character and professional standards. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more updates from Stateline Media. Thanks for watching.